see if I can get this in here. Not practiced at the Donahue talk show. Holding on to it. All right. Does that work? Can you hear me? No?
We're working on the volume. You can't find the right settings. It's too techy.
Yeah, just move it over.
It's an iPad. How about that? Does that work? Okay. Thanks so much for that lovely introduction, Tom. The truth about why I went to Harvard, actually, is because it was walking distance from, or I could live walking distance from Fenway Park. And I spent much of graduate school doing exactly that. You could get student standing room tickets for $8, and I would go on a weeknight because I would then scope it out. It was always sold out. There were no seats. All you had to do, though, was find a family with little kids on a weeknight because they were going to have to go home by about the 4th inning. So that's why I went to Harvard. But I am truly delighted to be here today, and I would have been anyway, but I'm especially delighted because there was a little blip yesterday. Wasn't 100% sure I would get here. My oldest son was riding his bike to school when a pickup truck struck him. And he is fine. He is fine. But I wasn't 100% sure I was going to know that before my flight left. So thanks so much to Tom and to everybody for your patience with me yesterday when I called and said this might not go according to plan. But he will be fine, and here we are. So what I'd like to do this morning is begin talking to you, or talk to you about, just as Tom said, about the contents of the first book I wrote, which started as my doctoral dissertation and then grew into a book. It really was my all-absorbing interest for several years of my life, and it's quite a delight to go back to it. I haven't thought about it in recent years. But we are going to start not with me. We're going to start hopefully with this working. Where is it?
Right at the second, the left, the far left. Stay out of the tech business. I'm sorry. Pass my paper.
Okay. All right, there we go. Second time is the charm. All right, we're going to start not with me. We are going to start with the voices. The right ones, yes indeed. We're going to start with the voices of some of the young, often very young men who fought in the Civil War. In 1862, the enlisted men of the 13th Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry wrote in their camp newspaper. This was their own, uncensored by their officers. They kept these things for just themselves. They called it the Wisconsin Volunteer, and in the pages of the Wisconsin Volunteer, they wrote that the fact that slavery is the sole undeniable cause of this infamous rebellion, that it is a war of, by, and for slavery, is as plain as the noonday sun. Sounds like Petersburg. Enlisted Confederates did not always agree, in fact almost never agreed with the soldiers of Wisconsin, but some enlisted Confederates in Missouri, in their own paper, which they called the Vedette, similarly insisted that any man who pretends to believe that this is not a war for the emancipation of the blacks is either a fool or a liar. Now, if you're anything like me, when you first see those words up there, or anything like me when I first encountered those words, you're probably asking yourself, what the heck is going on here? Why would ordinary men...
You got it? You got it.
It's
working.
There should have been another line that showed up, that's right. If you're anything like I was, what the heck is going on here? That is not what I expected enlisted soldiers to be saying. Why would ordinary soldiers identify slavery as the cause of the war? Why would they think that was important enough to fight about, to leave their homes and to leave their families? And how would the experience of the war itself changed their ideas about slavery. And so what I'm going to do today is share the answers to those questions that I arrived at after reading thousands of letters and diaries and camp newspapers written by enlisted Union and Confederate soldiers during the Civil War. And what I learned eventually, although it took me an embarrassingly long time to figure this out, is that the men who wrote those words, when they said slavery was the cause of the war, they were not speaking in code, and they were not using a metaphor for something. They were calling it like it is. When they said that slavery's role in the war was as plain as the noonday sun, and when they called anyone else who thought otherwise a fool or a liar, they meant that in their view, slavery was the cause of the Civil War. Now, as the war progressed, it really solidified Confederate attitudes towards slavery while altering how they felt about the Confederacy. And the opposite happened for Union soldiers. The war solidified their ideas about the Union, but changed their ideas about slavery in ways that foreshadowed both the achievements and the disappointments of Reconstruction. So none of that should you take my word for. It took me a long time to figure it out. So what I'd like to do today is get better at this. The second thing I'd like to do today is explain what slavery meant to Confederate soldiers, to white Union soldiers, and to black Union soldiers. And I would like to uncover exactly how that connected to the war. I'd like to trace how soldiers' ideas about slavery changed over the course of the war. And then I want to talk a little bit about how I came to draw these conclusions, so you can decide if you should believe them or not. And finally, I want to conclude with what I think the benefit is. What good does it do us to think about, talk about, ask questions about soldiers, slavery, and the Civil War? There is a conspicuous absence from this list. What am I not talking about? I am not talking necessarily about why individual soldiers enlisted in the Army. About 2 million Union and 1 million Confederates enlisted, which means there are about 3 million different reasons to join the Army. My favorite example being this one, right here. John Wesley Halliburton's reason for joining the Union Army. Now, John Halliburton was a student from Tennessee. He was at the University of North Carolina when secession happened, utterly convinced that secession was completely illegal. There was no justification for secession, however upset that he and others might be about Lincoln's election. You couldn't secede, you just couldn't do it. But at the same time, he was also vigorously trying to convince his cousin Juliet, also Halliburton, to marry him. And she was holding out, and she was an ardent secessionist. So he enlisted in the Army so that she would marry him. Which in fact worked, she did. And he survived, so that worked out all right. So my point is, I'm not trying to say that John Halliburton signs his enlistment papers for the exact same reason as 3 million other people do. He did not. But what I am saying is that the experiences of the war, the run-up to the war and the war itself, really did create a quite common perception of why that war happened in the first place. Whatever your own reasons might be, why that war was happening. And those came down to slavery. Well, that just made no sense to me. It just made no sense to me. Why on earth would enlisted Confederates, more than 2/3 of whom came from families who did not own slaves, why would they think that a war about slavery mattered? And why would Union soldiers from farms in Minnesota or upstate New York or a shoe factory in Lynn, Massachusetts, minimal if any contact with enslaved people, why would they think that was an important enough reason for a war to break out? That's what I had to discover. That's what I had to figure out. I had to figure out exactly why it was that Confederate soldiers, whose chief concern at the beginning, the middle, and the end of the war remained the well-being of their loved ones, of their families, why would they think that well-being and those interests, and sometimes the very survival of those loved ones, depended on the survival of slavery? Why would they agree with James Williams, who wrote, "Confound the whole set of psalm-singing brethren and cistern too. If it had not been for them preaching abolitionism from every northern pulpit, I never would have been soldiering." Why would he believe that? Well, so that's the first thing I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about why someone like James Williams would believe that. What did slavery mean to him? Why were threats of it, threats to slavery, threats to him? At root, for white Southerners, slavery, the institution of slavery, was so foundational to their society. It was so interconnected with so many things that deeply mattered to them, that even if they did not own slaves, which most did not, they perceived threats to the institution of slavery as direct threats to themselves and, more important, to the people that they loved. And one thing that Southerners deeply cared about and that they felt abolitionism was a threat to was the American Revolution. A few muskets there for the revolution. Yeah, there we go. They deeply cared about the legacy of the American Revolution. They interpreted that legacy in some pretty distinctive, particular ways. The legacy of the American Revolution, to the average white Southerner, what it taught was that government existed to fulfill the duty of furthering the interests of the governed. And when a government did not do that, the governed had the right to rebel against it. Lincoln's election meant that now the United States government, the executive branch of the United States government, was now in the hands of somebody who would be insufficiently protective of the South's most basic interest, the institution of slavery. And I should have Ivy Dugan up here. Yes, I do. So Ivy Dugan, a private in the 15th Georgia, explained this reasoning when he said, "Our revolutionary fathers taught us to resist oppression, to declare and maintain independence, to govern ourselves as we think best. If the revolutionary generation could not endure a tax on tea because it violated a sacred principle, how could we submit to be governed by those whose steady determination is to sacrifice our happiness and even our lives in the abolition of an institution guaranteed to us by the Constitution of our fathers?" So you see the direct connection between the legacy of the Revolution and the preservation of slavery in someone like Ivy Dugan here. Part of that legacy of the Revolution was liberty and equality for white people. And again, most Confederates interpret those terms in pretty specific ways. I hate vague terms. Liberty can mean a gazillion things. So here is what they meant. Liberty to them meant the right of white men to further their own interests and their families' material interests without outside interference. And the most direct way to do that was through property ownership. So there's a concrete link between liberty and property ownership in the minds of Confederates. As soon, in their thinking, as soon as you start messing with a family's right and ability to acquire whatever kind of property they have a mind to, you are messing with their liberty. And we see this point in another soldiers' camp paper, the Missouri Army Argus in 1861, which is in fact that I have up there, good, which asks what interest, and by that it means material interest, what interest has General Sterling Price or Governor Claiborne Jackson or General or Governor anybody else? How are they or the officers more interested than you or I? Now again, interested, he means pecuniary, he means material interests. And what he's telling his readers, and this is an enlisted guy writing this, your and my pecuniary interests are just as much at stake. Your right, my right to pursue property ownership, just as much at stake here as General or Governor anybody. He's also, in the second part of this passage, getting at how white Southerners interpret the ideal of equality. That too is connected to slavery. In the obvious, like the sort of straightforward way of as long as slavery for black people exists, white people are all equal in not being slaves. But But the connection goes even deeper when we think about the sort of socioeconomics of the 19th century, which were an enormously mobile century, the 19th century was, in terms of geographic mobility and social mobility. People then, you won't believe me, but this is true, people then moved a lot more than they do now. If you look at any decennial census, 1820 to 30 or 30 to 40 or any of those, for settled counties in the United States, half the people in the county at the first census are gone by the second census. Sure, some of them have died. Mostly, though, they've picked up stakes and they've moved. People are moving all the time in the 19th century, and they're often moving in pursuit of economic opportunity, which is available. There is a social ladder. You can go up it, but it's also a century in which it's super easy to go down that ladder. It is a century of great insecurity, and that insecurity connected to downward as well as upward mobility. So especially to the economically insecure, the hope that no matter how slim our fortunes might be right now, we might be rich enough someday. We might be able to attain property ownership someday. We might be able to attain slave ownership someday. That someday stakes a claim to white equality and a competitive world that offered few other guarantees. While, again, promising Southern whites that even if you don't, at least you can't fall into that bottom stratum, no matter how much or far you move. And we see that connection between slavery and equality in the second half of this quote, when the author points out, "There is not a soldier in this army who is not a free man, not a soldier who may not become rich or great. One man has as much at stake, as much to gain or lose as any other." So far we might say that slavery matters to Confederate soldiers because it connects to their political principles. That's what I think the revolution and the liberty and equality, we can call those their political principles. And slavery matters for those. It also matters for their social values. Good. Chief among those, moral stability and orthodoxy, the certainty that you can count on the world being the way that it's supposed to be. Slavery secured Southern claims to moral orthodoxy. Slavery appears in the Bible. It is never once questioned in the Bible. It is not questioned in the Old Testament. Jesus does not question it in the Gospels. Who are Northern abolitionists to think they know better than God to question this institution of slavery? There is something heretical about that. And so slavery is connected to this, this sense of order and this sense of respect for authority. One soldier who just sticks in my mind, his name was A.H. Mitchell, and he's worried about the North, and he's worried that the North means abolition, and he's worried about abolition because abolition will certainly mean spiritualism, which means the occult, and free love. These things are inextricable for him. And it is, it's clever and it's amusing and it's also not accidental. He is actually offering us insight into a pretty deep connection between what slavery means to white Southerners, particularly white Southern men, and how they think about the social order, how they think about their place in the social order, how they think about families in the social order, and how they think about gender roles. And I know this sounds airy-fairy and abstract, but it's not. This is about as earthy and visceral as it gets. To put it very baldly, Confederate soldiers were absolutely convinced that if you mess around with slavery, the family is going to fall apart. If it falls apart, who am I in the world? How do I even know if I am a man anymore? And they thought that even if they owned no slaves, because in Southern society, the way it worked was people had definite roles and definite places. And you can move up and down the economic ladder, but your social role is clear, and you can tell what it is by looking at you, because it's a function of your age and your race and your gender. Within families, within households, within society as a whole, adult white men possessed the right and the duty to command and also to protect dependents, such as women and children. Slavery also meant they had the right to command black people even if they didn't own any. Now this expresses itself sometimes in very concrete ways. Very widespread practice in the antebellum South was not just slave ownership, but slave hiring, renting. Hiring renting an enslaved person or more for a season or a month or even a year. So many who never own slaves participate in mastery, participate in command by renting other people's. But even if you don't, even if you never hire a slave, if you are a white man, your place in society is clear. You command and also have the duty to protect everybody underneath you. Well, if white men can't do that anymore, society could fall apart, family could fall apart. And how do men then do their chief duty? How do they protect their loved ones? How do they protect their wives and children if all of society falls apart? The Richmond Enquirer began warning about this very danger. Oh, wrong one. Sorry about that. The Richmond Enquirer began worrying about this very danger before the war even began, when it warned, or noted, I might even see as a warning, it noted that where two races approximate equality in numbers, slavery is the only protection of the laboring classes against the evils of amalgamation. The delicate way to say amalgamation would be racial intermarriage. They didn't necessarily mean the marriage part, though. All over the place, soldiers' writings echo this very fear. One recruit joined the army because he overheard that enslaved people in the neighborhood, after the outbreak of the war, had already begun discussing who they would make their wives among our young ladies. Only white men should be able to do that, or else society falls apart. Now, as the war progressed, this theme of lascivious enslaved men threatening the virtue of Southern white women is all over the place in Southern soldiers' letters. Didn't expect it when I headed out to research these letters, was really struck by it every time I saw it, which was often. So, social values, moral orthodoxy, stability, the family, connected to the preservation of slavery. So is another distinctly Southern value, the Southern value or notion of honor, which is again a word that can mean many things. It means something specific for 19th century white Southerners. And it's very connected to what we might say reputation, what other people say about you. Specifically, what do they say about how authoritatively do you exercise control over subordinates, over women, over children, over Black Americans? And because it's a quality dependent on what other people say about you, it's a vulnerable quality. It is vulnerable to insult. It must be protected. It's not enough if you say you do these things well. Others have to say it about you, which means when they don't, you have to react, or your honor is in question. So these outside Northerners reproaching us about slavery is insulting Southern honor, just as my neighbor saying that I don't control my children very well would be insulting my honor. Now that kind of insult in the antebellum South, your wife is out of control, that means a duel. So, insulting the whole white South's honor by questioning slavery amounts to a gigantic duel, and we call it the Civil War. And that is what a Texas man named Charles Trueheart meant when he explained to his sister that he had to fight because there is no other alternative left us unless we humble our heads in the dust at the feet of Black Republican masters, disgraced in our own eyes, and before the eyes of the world. Most important in my view, others might see any of this as the most important driving factor. I think these are all important. Here's the one I think is most important. I think for ordinary Southern soldiers, the preservation of slavery in their minds is directly connected to their own and their loved ones' basic safety and survival. They live in a society that is 40% Black and enslaved. They are pretty sure that 40% of their fellow Southerners have very good reason to be angry and hold a grudge at the other 60% of Southerners. Whatever they say about treating them like our own children and all the rest, they know that there's a good reason for 40% of our neighbors to be unhappy with us. They are genuinely worried that if slavery goes away, race war, at least violence, would result. And the people that they loved the most in the world would be in danger. Back to Ivy Dugan, he talked about the revolution, remember, no tax on, well, you can't stand tax on tea. This is even worse. He also is the same guy who insists that abolition meant fire, sword, and even poison as instruments, and desolating our homes, ruining us, and degrading our children. These are real fears. These are the things people care about. These are the things people will fight about. These are the things people think a war is worth. Not worth, let me backtrack. These are things that people think are important enough for a war to start. These are the things that for most Confederates cannot be separated from the institution of slavery. But we need to talk about timing here. Slavery's not new in 1861. Abolitionists aren't new in 1861. So how is it that we get a war in 1861? Why didn't it come earlier? Why didn't it come later? And the short answer to that question is the election of 1860. In the election of 1860, 4 candidates ran for office. All of them have something to say about slavery because nobody could avoid it by that time. One of them, Stephen Douglas, Northern Democrat, ran on the platform that you should just let local communities sort slavery out for themselves. And he means the white voters, but white voters in every community should vote slavery up or down. This is the platform that he takes to the Democratic Convention of 1860, and when he does, the delegates from the southern states walk out. And they do because that's not safe enough. And so they, it's not that dangerous. That's not safe enough. So instead, they rally behind a second Democratic candidate, John Breckinridge, who runs on a platform demanding a federal slave code. Federal slave code means that if a territory is in the United States, it is a slave territory, and the resources of the federal government need to be pledged to protecting and promoting slavery in federal territories. That is Breckinridge's platform. He runs on that in 1860. 2 parties, we're not even out of the Democratic Party yet. Or 2 candidates, and we're not out of the Democratic Party yet. The Republican candidate, who appears on the ballot only in the northern states, is a fellow you may have heard of. His name is Abraham Lincoln. He runs on the platform that the federal government is powerless to touch slavery in states where it exists, but it does not have to extend that institution any further. The federal government does not have to nationalize what should remain a state and local institution, and therefore, the Republican Party will stop the expansion, the extension. Slavery will not go into new federal territories. And then finally, we get candidate number 4, John Bell, who runs on the Constitutional Union Party. His platform is, let's just not talk about slavery and hope it goes away. The problem, not slavery. Well, his plan, that didn't work so well for him. Who else it didn't work out so well for was Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas, on this map, you probably can't see from that far away, the brown states are Stephen Douglas. He's the guy who said, look, let states and local communities decide for themselves. The voters in those states should decide, slavery or not. He wins Missouri, which is always weird. And he splits the vote in part of Maryland. That's it. That's all he gets. Breckinridge, the federal slave code guy, he gets all the other green states you see, which is most of the South. Constitutional Union, let's not talk about it and hope the problem goes away. John Bell, he picks up Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia, the states who are most afraid that if this thing does go to war, it's going to happen in our backyard, he picks up those states. But the vote is so splintered that that means that Lincoln, the Republican on the nope, doesn't go any further, he wins in the election of 1860. Well, this is a blow to white Southerners, because what it means is the federal government might not be on our side anymore. Southerners had exerted disproportionate control in the federal government up to this point. They'd held the chief executive 50 out of 72 years. They had consistently dominated the important committees in Congress, Ways and Means and things like that. The way that proportioning in the Senate and the House works, every 4 white Southerners have as much voting clout as every 10 white Northerners. The federal government's been their ally, has always been their ally. But the election of this guy means that might be coming to an end. Not only that, they just elected this guy, those states are growing faster, anti-slavery sentiment is growing in those states, and they won't even enforce our Fugitive Slave Act anymore. So, first South Carolina, then 6 more, and eventually 11 more Confederate states would leave the Union, and they would tell us why. They were pretty upfront in their ordinances of secession. They're getting out of Dodge because of the lack of a federal slave code, because of insufficient enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act, and because of growing abolitionist sentiment in the North. Fine, that's why secession 1860, not earlier or later. I knew that before I started my dissertation. I knew that people who went and voted in secession conventions thought this stuff and said this stuff. But what I didn't think was that regular soldiers saw themselves here. I thought that they operated differently, that this did not describe their view, it did not describe their world, and that's what I wanted to know about, what regular people think. And surprisingly to me, although maybe not to you, what they thought was kind of what those ordinances of secession said. I saw a repetition of the theme over and over that Lincoln's election meant abolition, and abolition was a direct threat to the white South. I should have Winsmith up here. Oh, no, I don't. Anyway, there are the leaders explaining why we're getting out of here. Can't trust this Lincoln guy anymore. But how about the guys who actually fought? Do they echo these themes or not? And the answer, and it surprised me, is yeah, they do. Christopher Winsmith urged the whole South to make common cause against hordes of abolitionists who are swarming southwards. Joseph Bruckmuller, he's the second guy. He was a German immigrant, lived in Texas, and Lincoln's election inspired him to put a piece in the local newspaper urging his fellow adoption citizens, his fellow immigrants in Texas, to stand by your own countrymen and race against the murder and arson, hanging and stealing that were sure to accompany the liberation of the half-civilized cannibal. And he is sure that that's what Lincoln's election means. So I think what we have when the war breaks out are slaveholding and non-slaveholding Confederate soldiers who genuinely, they are not bluffing. I think in their gut, they believe that the safety, the best interests, and the survival of themselves and their families depended on the survival of slavery. Lincoln threatened that survival, and that threat had to be stopped. Now, those are the Confederates. Just because they thought Union soldiers or the Lincoln or the North was out to abolish slavery does not necessarily mean that Lincoln or Union soldiers or the North was out to abolish slavery. People get each other's motives wrong all the time. So, what did Union soldiers have to say for themselves at the outbreak of this war? All right. And once again, I knew the Republican platform. I mean, I'm one of those people who think that Lincoln actually really did want slavery to go away. I don't think that Confederates were 100% wrong about Lincoln, but I didn't expect ordinary soldiers to be motivated in quite the same way. Few were abolitionists, few had even seen a slave before the war, and plenty harbor the same racial prejudices that 19th century Americans generally harbored. And indeed, at first for them, the war is mostly about saving the Union, and not necessarily ending, not perpetuating, but slavery as a sidebar and not at the center. And that is how many of them start the war. But that also raised a question. So why does the Union matter? And it's kind of an abstraction. Like, why would that matter? What would it mean to Union soldiers? And the Union and its survival really mattered to Union soldiers because they honestly believed that the government formed by the founders in the American Revolution had to survive in order to prove to the world that Republican self-government could work, that elected government could work, people could govern themselves. Not a lot of that had been tried in 1776. Not a lot had worked by 1861. Union soldiers are pretty worried that if it does not work here, nobody will try it again. Now, we can say that they might have been full of self-importance in believing this, fine, but they were also sincere in believing that the hope of democratic elected self-government worldwide is resting on the survival of this elected democratic government. The destruction of the Union would turn the whole idea of elected self-government based on principles like liberty and equality into a laughingstock. It would destroy the whole world's hopes for self-government. And there is only one way for elected self-government to work, and that is to abide by election results even when you don't like them. And there is no basis for self-government other than that. So if this thing fell apart because some people didn't like an election, then the whole experiment of the founders, the whole revolution, was a failure. Nobody in the world would try it again. And that is what soldiers mean when they say things like, destroy this union, and what can republics hope for? That's what Lee Weber, he was a farm laborer born in Iowa, working in Kansas when the war broke out. He enlisted in the 1st Kansas. He was not kidding, he meant it. When he meant that he felt this way, at least. When he said, if we fail now, the hope of human rights is extinguished for the ages. I don't see a lot of slavery there. So where's slavery fit for these guys? Well, the way it fit for them is that what has put this union in danger? Why did those states secede? Why are they putting the experiment of the revolution up on the block like this? Well, they are because they don't like the election of a guy who pledged to halt the westward expansion of slavery. They told us why. We read those ordinances of secession. They plainly state that they're seceding to protect slavery. And that makes this war about slavery, whether I like it or not, because slavery is what has put this experiment at risk. Spending time in the South, actually seeing slavery at work, which most had not done before the war, only furthered their conviction that the only way to win this war, to save this union and prevent the threat from rising again, is to get rid of the cause. You have to get rid of what caused the problem if you're going to save the union. So I should have the Wisconsin guys. Nope, I don't need my Wisconsin guys up. There we go. So Wisconsin soldiers from everywhere, these guys are from Wisconsin, start commenting as early as the fall of 1861 about the impact of the outbreak of war, but also seeing slavery on their views. And they write, the rebellion is abolitionizing the whole army. You have no idea of the changes that have taken place in the minds of the soldiers in the last 2 months. Men of all parties seem unanimous in the belief that to permanently establish the Union is first to wipe out the institution of slavery. He is part of a broad pattern that begins from August to December of 1861. You're ahead of the Emancipation Proclamation, in which enlisted men throughout the Union Army begin to insist that the only way we win this war, and keep it won, is to destroy slavery. They're ahead of their officers. They are ahead of most civilians back home. The only people who are ahead of them are enslaved people, who are part of why they changed their mind, and the abolitionists back home. But they're a very early contingent in that, like, you gotta end slavery, or we A, lose, or B, fight this thing again. The longer they spent in the South, the more they became convinced that slavery had to go. A, it was the big threat to the Union, but B, it has to be angering God. It has to be. 1/3 of slave marriages or partnerships, marriage wasn't recognized, but partnerships in the Upper South, where Union soldiers are located in 1861 and 1862, 1/3 of them are broken up by sale. Half of all children under the age of 14, after which they don't count as children. My 17-year-old was the kid hit yesterday. I think they're still children, but half of all children under the age of 14 are sold away from at least one parent. Union soldiers see that. Many of them, there are certainly parts of families, some have their own children. That makes an enormous impression on them. It makes them pretty convinced that, God, we don't win without God on our side, and God is not on this side. God cannot be on this side. Cyrus Boyd is an Iowa soldier who just sticks with me. He witnessed, actually physically witnessed, a young girl, 7, maybe 8, light-skinned, but enslaved, sold away from her mother. And he wrote home immediately to say that seeing that sight, it instilled in him the feeling that, by God, I'll fight until hell freezes over. And then I'll cut the ice and fight on. We need a little short detour here to talk about soldiers from the border states. There are 4 states who remain in the Union who are themselves slave states. Kentucky, this group already knows it, but I go into teacher mode. Kentucky, Delaware, Missouri, and Maryland, by and large, Union soldiers from those states are non-slaveholders. There certainly are men from those states who do fight with the Confederacy. Their logic is a little different than I've just described. Their logic in the early years of the war is, you guys who say we have to choose between Union and slavery are crazy. The Union has been the best bulwark for all of our rights, including slavery, since 1776. Like, you're making the problem, not the Union. Stay in the Union, that's where your interests are best protected. So there's a healthy contingent of soldiers in the early years who actually think that it's the Union that will be the best upholder of slavery, or at least there's no contest between those two things. They take longer to change their minds on that issue than soldiers from non-slaveholding states do, but they change their minds on that issue well before civilians at home do. For them, it is the war. It's being in this war. It's realizing that you guys were right about why this war happened, and I don't want to fight it again, and don't want to choose between slavery and Union, but if I have to, I will, and if that means getting rid of slavery, that means getting rid of slavery. That's the logic for more border state soldiers. So they're a bit different from somebody from Minnesota, by and large. But they, too, connect the survival of the Union with the destruction of slavery. An enormous caveat to all of this: hostility to slavery did not necessarily, or even remotely, mean support for racial equality. Ending slavery, one thing; rights for formerly enslaved people, totally different. There's a Wisconsin soldier named Del Bly, who I think conveys this point as pithily as anybody. And he said, I have a good deal of sympathy for the slave, but the Negro, I want the further off the better. And that is exactly how Union troops operate for much of the war, certainly for the first couple of years of the war. Slavery, one thing; what that means about race and all that, totally different, don't need to talk about that. Let's focus on the slavery thing. As you might guess, not everybody thinks it's quite so simple. There's Cyrus. There's Del. As soon as the war breaks out, Black Americans are pretty sure you're not going to be able to keep these things separate, that you might try and keep your nice little compartments with slavery in one and the demands of Black people in another, but you're not going to be able to. You're going to have to deal with both. Black Americans figured that out pretty quickly, Frederick Douglass being one of them. And in the very first weeks of the war, Black men do try to join the Union Army. They are barred until 1862-63, but once admitted, about 180,000 black men fought for the Union. And that too, I had to explain why. In retrospect, it seems obvious, but it wasn't obvious at the time. United States government had supported slavery, had oppressed and enslaved their ancestors for generations. Why would they care if the Union survived or not? And the answer is that they too linked the Union with the end of slavery. In that sense, they actually, they sound like white Union soldiers. Henry Harmon, sorry about that. Henry Harmon, who was in the 3rd United States Colored Troops, vowed that we fight to preserve the glorious Union for which our fathers preserved for us, the source of our country's rights, and our people's rights. That could have been a white soldier. Here's what worked a little bit differently between white soldiers and black Union soldiers. White Union troops saw slavery as necessary to save the Union. Black Union troops saw saving the Union as necessary to ending slavery. That if the Union loses, if the Confederacy goes off its merry way, then 4 million people remain enslaved. So if slavery is going to end, the Union has to win. And Harmon went on to add, he knew this, he went on to add, the God of battles knows the justice of our cause, freedom for our brothers in bondage, and the prospects of our race in general. Another black man from Tennessee added the point that the Union and the reason to save it was to carry out this bold idea of liberty. He didn't mean property ownership. For him, liberty meant some people don't own other people. That's what liberty means for him. So that's one big reason why black Union troops will fight for the Union. But they also they use a phrase over and over explaining their decision to fight, which is at first not immediately obvious what they mean. Over and over, black Union troops talk about fighting for the manhood of the race. And as it turns out, they actually mean 2 things by that. One of them is manhood as adult male identity, masculinity. Ending slavery is the way that they care for their loved ones. If you're an enslaved man, you can't care for your dependents. You can't even ensure they won't be sold away. It's slavery that prevents you from fulfilling the duties of manhood. So in one sense, that's what the Union victory will mean for black Americans, that black men, like white men, can care for their own loved ones. Families, black families can remain intact. There's a very famous articulation of exactly this logic in the words of a Missouri soldier called Spotswood Rice. I hope is who I have up there, yes I do. Spotswood Rice joins a Union regiment that is, as luck would have it, going to march through the area where his children, who've been taken from him, sold from him, are still held in bondage by a woman named Miss Kitty. He's a Union soldier now, and he lets Miss Kitty know exactly what that means to him. To Miss Kitty, he writes, "You call my children your property. Not so with me. My children is my own, and I expect to get them. And when I get ready to come after Mary, his daughter, I will have both the power and authority to bring her away and execute vengeance on them that holds my child." The part I didn't put up there, he tells her later in the letter, in case she missed it the first time, she would burn in hell if she prevented a man and a father from caring for his own child. So, first thing manhood of the race means is men caring for, the ability to care for their loved ones. But it also means the full humanity of all black Americans, which the institution of slavery undermines. Yeah. Oh, there's the burning hell. There we go. All humans, black Americans, like all other human beings, have the right to basic human rights like sustenance and shelter and compensation for their labor, the autonomy to care for themselves, their loved ones. They were also entitled to the basic respect, decency, and dignity that all other human beings were entitled to. And sometimes that's what they meant when they said they were fighting for the manhood of the race. Or in the words of Joseph Williams, to attain greatness as a type in the human family. So fighting for the Union is to smash the chains of slavery of ideally prejudice, don't worry, I'm almost done, that bound all black Americans. Now, the war, of course, changed things. It changed people's ideas. Here's how they start. As I said at the beginning, some things change and some don't for both Union and Confederate soldiers. Confederate soldiers become a bit disillusioned with the Confederacy. Remember, if the point of a government is to protect your material interests, your connection to that government gets strained when it's that government that is interfering with your material interests, which the Confederate government has to do to fight a war in a much more direct way than the United States government ever had. So as the war unfolds, white Southern families find their interests not actually, their pecuniary interests harmed and not hurt by the Confederate government. And that strains attachment to the Confederacy, but it does not break it. And it doesn't break it because, bad as the Confederacy was, what it would not do, soldiers thought, was emancipate, would not end slavery. And so you have to put up with what you have to put up with in order to preserve and make sure that slavery doesn't go away. So affection for the Confederacy, that declines, but conviction that slavery must be protected, that actually stays pretty firm. And let's see if I have. And we see that logic in letters, particularly between husbands and wives. Wives will write to their husbands saying, the deal was, you protect me when you don't, the Confederate government protects me, neither of you are, what are we in this thing for? One such woman who did that was Melinda Street, a Texas woman pregnant in 1862, terrified of giving birth on her own, wants her husband home. And she tells him, like, your duty as a man is to your family, your wife, your children, get back here. And she wants him to desert, actually, get back here. He says, not a chance. And the reason is that he insisted that to stop fighting would mean lying supinely upon our backs, while the fair daughters of the South are reduced to a level with the flat-footed, thick-lipped Negro. So that doesn't change. That part, what they feel about the Confederacy, that stays put. What they feel about the need to protect slavery, that lasts for the duration of the war. And for Union soldiers, it kind of goes the other way, as I said. They remain convinced that the Union needs to survive. They quickly decide that slavery needs to go away. That was somebody proving, that was just somebody who you could listen to other than me, saying, I don't like the Confederate government anymore, but slavery we need. You might be asking, why does it break? For many, it breaks when the Confederate Congress enacts black enlistment. Actually, we'll go back, because that's what that was. Confederate Congress enacts black enlistment to keep an army in the field in the spring of 1865, and that is the last straw for many men, including this guy here, Grant Taylor. Grant Taylor wrote his wife to say, the big bugs say things have changed, that we must bring the Negroes in and make them fight, or we will be made slaves of ourselves. Well, if we are reduced to that extremity, stop this war at once and let us come home. For if we are to depend on the slaves for our freedom, it is gone anyway. Good as his word, he deserted the following week. And these army just drained men in the last weeks of the war, couldn't hold Richmond, and you know the rest. So that's what changes and stays the same for Confederates. For Union soldiers, rightness of the Union, never doubt that. Quickly decide, gotta get rid of slavery or else we'll fight this thing again. Try to keep slavery and race separate. Try to think of slavery as a Southern problem and not a national one. That one, that last part, that comes under a little pressure as the war progresses. The war keeps going. Even after Emancipation Proclamation, it keeps going. Why does it keep going? We got rid of the slavery part, they think. It's not done yet. So why does it keep going? Not all, but some of them genuinely begin to express thoughts they never did before the war. And those thoughts include things like, maybe we're part of the problem. Maybe it's the attitudes so widespread among us as well as them about black people that are part of the problem. And so it is not the case that the Union Army becomes full of civil rights activists. But it is the case that by the end of the war, there are men examining the Northern role in slavery like there had not been before the war, and who are open to things like 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which Union veterans vote for, far disproportionately to civilians. And it's the war that made them reconsider things they never would have otherwise. And so there is reason for hope in the spring of 1865. And the people who know that the most are Black Union soldiers. David Williamson is sure that liberty is in reach of all men without respect to color. And it's super easy now, because we know what happened, to look back and see him as naive. But in 4 years, centuries-old institution of slavery had been abolished. Black soldiers were fighting in the army for equal pay. A number of northern states were scheduling referenda on black suffrage. He had every reason to think, the ball is rolling, it's going to keep rolling forward. It did not. So I think what we can safely conclude is that the war created vast potential for change and then did not fulfill it. And if we want to know the not fulfill it, why? I think our pal Del Bly, once again, sort of pithily sums it up. I have a great deal of sympathy for the slave. I like the Negro, the further off the better. The war disrupted Northern ideas about slavery, began to move the needle on their ideas about race. After the war, after the crisis, those ideas start to move back. All right, very quickly, how did I figure this stuff out, and why should you believe me? Well, I didn't start to figure this out exactly at all. I was, as I said, convinced that regular soldiers were not going to have much to say about slavery one way or another. That wouldn't be where their mental universe was. What I really wanted to know was, how did they think about these abstractions, the Union and the Confederacy, and how did they link those things to where they lived, to their home? Did patriotism look different based on geographic location, not just north or south, but did the Union mean the same thing to someone from Minnesota as it did to someone from Manhattan? Did it look the same if you worked in a shoe shop as if you farmed your own land? Did it look the same if you were a Chesapeake planter or an Alabama dirt farmer? Did it look the same if you worked in the Tredegar, the largest ironworks in the country in Tredegar, Virginia, as it did if you grew sugar? That's what I wanted to know. I wanted to hear soldiers talk about what Union and Confederate meant and how it connected to their homes. Headed off to the archives. By the way, totally a question that only a graduate student could love. I get that. But I was a graduate student at the time, so I head off into the archives, and what I really want is, I want a soldier who says things like, I see the flag and I think of my farm, or stuff like that. And they did not cooperate with me. They wouldn't do that, and they were really annoying me. And they kept talking about slavery, which they weren't supposed to do. So I actually spent an embarrassingly long amount of time really resisting exactly what my sources were telling me, because it wasn't what I thought they were supposed to do, and I wanted them just to come on already, guys, do what I want. And eventually it dawned on me, wait a minute, what you didn't expect to find is exactly what you have to explain. And so that is how I came to, that's how the project became what it became. It didn't start out as a look at slavery at all, it became that way. And it became that way because I read a lot of Dead Guy's Mail. I went to libraries and archives throughout the states that fought, North and South, and the great thing about Civil War soldiers' letters is guys are away from home for 4 years, and they have to put in writing the things they would normally have said. They have to commit their ideas to paper in ways they usually wouldn't have. And they were precious keepsakes, so families kept them. And in many cases later donated them. And I did go to the Library of Congress and the National Archives, but mainly I went to the Minnesota Historical Society or the Jackson County Public Library, all over, to find the collections of people I'd never heard of. And that you'd never heard of, and that was the point. And so I read thousands and thousands of soldiers' letters and their diaries about their war experiences. Does everyone agree on everything? No. If we asked vanilla or chocolate ice cream in this room, nobody, there would be disagreement. There's always disagreement. So everything I've told you, you can find exceptions, for sure. My rule for myself was, if I was going to say that one point of view took precedence over another, if I say I see a ship from August to December of 1861, I need to see the opinion I think is the dominant one, outnumbering the alternative by 3 to 1. So I need 30 guys saying one thing compared to 10 guys saying another, except larger multiples, to say that soldiers said or thought one or another thing. So that's how I did it. What do I think we get out of this? Why should we care? What's the benefit of looking at soldiers and slavery? And I'll tell you what I think the benefit is. You might disagree, but I think there are benefits. I think it's important that we do dislodge these assumptions about non-slaveholding Confederates not caring about slavery. I think it's important that instead we try to understand why. Okay, it's not logical to us that they would do that, but they did, and so why? And so we have to admit that they did in order to understand why. And it's only in understanding why that I think this war makes any sense. So that's one reason. I think we better understand when and why the Union's war became a war to end slavery. I think it's important that we understand the Union Army not as a late, reluctant convert, but actually as part of leading the charge to shift to a war to end slavery. I think it's important that we understand that when we say the Union Army, who are the connectors? How is this war taking direct aim at slavery? The first people who wanted to do that, of course, are enslaved people. Enslaved people don't have access to the levers of power. But they have access to Union soldiers. So in changing Union soldiers' mind, Union soldiers become the levers of power that begin to shift the war effort. And that's important, I think, for us to realize. I think looking at what soldiers thought about slavery helps us remember that 10% of the Union Army was black. And we cannot talk about what the Union Army did, thought, or said without talking about that 10%. Also, I think we're reminded it wasn't inevitable that black Americans would fight for the Union, and understanding why matters for the war. I think it's important for us to recapture this sense of possibility that existed in the spring of 1865. We know what happened afterwards. We know the disappointments of Reconstruction. It's far too easy for us to write those off as inevitable if we do not realize there's a moment when it could have been different. And so I think looking at what soldiers said, 1861 to 1865, reminds us there was a moment where it could have been different. And then overarchingly, I think looking at what Civil War soldiers thought about slavery does for all of us is make it impossible for us to keep neatly separated slavery as the Southern issue and instead recognize it as the deeply national issue that soldiers came to recognize it as well. I think it's important for us to follow their lead in that respect. So, thank you.